Good afternoon, everyone. It's difficult to know where to begin today. But I'll start where I started for the 5 lectures we have already experienced together. Welcome. I'm Stephanie Jones from the University of Georgia. And I'm humbled and honored to be with all of you here in person and all of you joining us on Zoom, especially today, which is our 6th and final lecture by our esteemed colleague, friend, and mentor, Dr. St.Pierre. And I'm going to begin with a very exciting announcement. The International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry, or what some of you might know as ICQI, has awarded our professor, Betty St.Pierre, with a Lifetime Achievement Award. Official announcement and celebration of this amazing award will happen at ICQI during their online conference in May. But we have the honor of today and to celebrate that tonight as well. You're joining us for the session. Our organizing committee has been very busy all year. Can you just hold up your hand or actually stand up would be great. So if you are part of the organizing committee, can you just stand up, please? Thank you. You have seen them all around doing all kinds of things. And a couple of them are here today for the first time because they're coming from a long distance away. So we're really happy for those of you who can be here today. Our organizing committee has been very busy all year. And one thing that we included in our busyness was to nominate Betty for this award. We all know that she is beyond deserving for this kind of honor. You are a legend, Betty. And we are incredibly grateful for everything you've done for 30 years and everything you continue to do. Our desire and commitment to learn with you for a year and honor your work has opened up many wondrous occasions for more than 450 people, and the reverberation is incomprehensible. Of course, we don't seek to know what this means, or even what it is, but we can acknowledge the vibration, the vitality, the movement, the waves, the intensities, the affect, the shifts. And you, in this room and beyond, you are early career and senior professors, teachers, independent researchers, adjunct faculty, research scientists, and graduate students who are from Tennessee Tech University, Kansas State University, University of Denver, University of Modena and Reggio Emilia, Italy, Florida International University, University of Alaska Southeast, Clemson University, University of Minnesota, University Jaun, maybe, Spain, someone can tell me how to say that. Lakehead University, Canada, Baylor University, University of Lincoln, UK, Springfield College, University of A Coruña in Spain, Goa State University, Brazil, Mercer University, Western Michigan University, University of Stockholm, Sweden, Florida State University, Canterbury Christ Church University, UK, University of Ottawa, Canada, University of Melbourne, Australia, University of Washington, Seattle, Kennesaw State University, Mykolas Romeras University, Lithuania, University de Siena, Italy, University of Manchester, UK, University of Southern Mississippi, University of Georgia. And I could go on for more than 300 more places. I'm remembering what our brilliant invited scholar Maggie McClure said this morning, when she said she's not sure that anything like this has happened. It hasn't been done before. Very exciting. We all began this Post Qualitative Inquiry lecture series in September 2024, with no idea that we would be standing in a fundamentally differently configured nation, and perhaps globe, as we continue to gather here in the month of March 2025. Systems of power, as I said in my introduction to lecture number 5 just last month, continue to emerge and reconfigure themselves. They are not static and never fully available to capture. This is something that we should already know, even if their emergence surprises and shocks us. Post-structuralism, feminist post-humanisms, indigenous theories, new materialisms, Marxist theories, Eastern philosophies, and other ethico-onto-epistemological constellations all offer us ways to enter into some basic understandings about power. They offer many varied, creative, and critical ways that we might become in relation to authoritarianism, neo-fascism, and violent attacks on humans, the planet, and all sentient beings. Professor Betty St.Pierre, inspired by Deleuze and Guattari, has written about the long preparation of reading and writing, mostly reading, arguing that nothing can take the place of reading and studying to prepare us for inquiry, for thought, for perceiving, for writing, for life. Professor Maggie McClure, our honored guest here today from Manchester, UK, has written about intensive reading and reminded us this morning that these jolts of knowing, feeling that come to us as scholars don't come from nowhere, but from the material discursive assemblage in which we are immersed in the immersion. Karen Spector and Elizabeth Ann Murray, also plugging into Deleuze, have written beautifully about reading with love. They say that for Deleuze, reading with love is a series of experimental encounters with the real world to see how texts work when plugged into other complex, emergent, and self-organizing desiring machines. I have not read the words of Margaret Atwood's dystopian novel, The Handmaid's Tale, but I have been doing another kind of reading, watching the adapted series for Hulu, the streaming service, and reading each episode intensively. One of the many internal monologues of June Osborne, the main character in The Handmaid's Tale, goes like this. Where does it come from, this talent for ruthlessness? It seems so easy for them, for these men, for men like these. That's how they won, I suppose. It isn't about being right or having the people or even God on your side. It isn't about anything that grandiose. In the end, victory goes to the hardest heart. To the ruthless go the spoils. What I think I want to say is that now is not the time for repetition of what we have already thought, done, said, imagined, assumed, or have predetermined. There is no lived experience we can draw on as preparation for today, or for inquiry today, as we are rocked with the intensities of ruthlessness and cruelty, of a kind of authoritarian patriarchy entangled with extremist weaponization of religion, colonialism, white supremacy, neoliberalism, and late-stage capitalism. But there is the long preparation of reading intensively, and reading with love. Experimental encounters with life as we plug into different texts that might illuminate various angles and cuts of power, agency, and human subjects. We are prepared. Entangle not with a predetermined outcome in mind, but with your own ethical intentions, and openness to difference and to newness. I also want to say that the posts remind us that no singular human being possesses autonomous will to simply exert power in the way that they desire. Even when that person acts as if they have total authority, their words, bodies, ideologies, and affects have no choice but to interact with the already existing and always becoming assemblage that always shapes what will become. This is not the time to be afraid and silent, for we are all active agents in what will happen next in our families, friendships, communities, workplaces, states, nations, and with our planet. It is not yet finished, done, and never will be. For many years, as Betty told us in lecture 1, I think, plenty of people have criticized post-structuralism for being too hard to read, too hard to understand, and this is an important one, for not being activist enough. If you have been with us since September, you are likely to realize that this is a deep failure to understand post-structuralism, and probably a signal that one has not yet read post-structuralism. I want to be clear that post-structuralism, feminist posthumanisms, new materialisms, indigenous onto-epistemologies, and all the news and posts to come are political projects. As Foucault wrote, cited by Betty in her paper for today, quote, "If I don't ever say what must be done, it isn't because I believe there is nothing to be done. On the contrary, it is because I think there are 1,000 things to do, to invent, to forge." This morning with Maggie McClure, we laughed out loud, shared stories of children's material objects being portals, collaborating with ghosts, wondered together. We drank coffee, hugged, smiled, and gathered in person and across the globe. One participant on Zoom shared that they like to think about our monthly gatherings this year as their meeting with Betty and the Jets. Continuing the rock concert t-shirt theme that we have going on. We are in serious business, and both resistance and new becomings will take our discipline and seriousness. It will also take our love, our joy, our humility, and gathering together. Speaking of gatherings, as we gather here today in Athens, it's important to acknowledge that the university is located on the unceded territory of Muscogee-speaking and Cherokee peoples, as well as other Native communities who were forcibly removed from their homelands. The lands occupied by the university throughout the state were the places of lived relationships, learning, ceremony, and resistance. We recognize these Native peoples as the original caretakers who continue to pass on their histories and traditions, sustaining connections to their ancestral lands and waters. These are not just words. While they may seem and feel performative at times, and a dear colleague of mine in this room and I just talked about this last week or two ago, this moment we're standing in a country where the president is prohibiting words. Prohibiting words that can be used on websites, in research, in classrooms, in grants, federal agencies, and in our public sphere. Words like woman, gender, marginalized, rest, immigrant, minority, underserved, anti-racist. These words and pages of words are being erased from websites, spoken language, as we're watching things unfold in real life. So words are powerful. Keep speaking them loud and clear and create new words and new language. I said this last time, but the proliferation of creativity, the arts, new language and new words and worlds, and new and different ways of being, doing, seeing, perceiving, speaking, and imagining have always been imperative to the fight against fascism, authoritarianism, dictators, Nazism, neoliberalism, colonialism, white supremacy, human supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. As Betty will say, just do the next thing. And don't worry about making your activism look like other people's activism. Our diversity, difference, and newness is indeed powerful. So Betty, thank you for giving us a reason to come together all year to study with you, to study with our brilliant invited scholars who have joined us. And one more time, please help me welcome Betty St.Pierre.
Good afternoon and welcome to the University of Georgia and to the last lecture in this year's series of 6 lectures about post-qualitative inquiry. Once again, I want to express my deep gratitude to my wonderful colleague, Stephanie Jones, who has been the chief organizer of the lecture series, and to our UGA colleagues, Dr. Melissa Freeman and Dr. Hillary Hughes, as well as Dr. Karen Spector, Dr. Corey Johnson, and Dr. Marty Schmeichel, who comprise the main faculty committee responsible for the series. I'm also very grateful to other faculty at UGA and other institutions who have supported the lecture series, to our committee of UGA students, and to our technology experts who are contributing their time to make each lecture possible. It's been quite a year for us here at UGA as renowned national and international scholars have come to Athens to talk about their work and inspire us. Dr. Aaron Kuntz, Dean of the School of Education and Human Development at Florida International University, a senior scholar whose work we've studied here at UGA for years, joined us last September. In October, Dr. Sophia Zhang, a former UGA student, now at The Ohio State University, and her colleague from Baylor University, Dr. Sarah Lynn McKinnon Crowley, both early career scholars, spoke with us about the trajectory and challenges of their already well-recognized work. In November, Professor Martin Kamir in the School of Human Kinetics at the University of Ottawa, whom I had just met in the literature, and who is setting the pace for his field for new work, joined us with two of his doctoral students. Dr. Alicia Jackson, one of my own amazing doctoral students, now a professor at Appalachian State University, and her longtime collaborator, Dr. Lisa Metze, at the University of Oregon, who was one of my fellow doctoral students at Ohio State, shared their stellar work with us. Lisa and Alicia are here again with us today. In February last month, Dr. Jonathan Eckel from George Washington University, another UGA graduate who is a lovely painter, as well as an outstanding Deleuzian scholar, showed us how to put Deleuze and Guattari's work to work. Dr. Hillevi Mansuguchi from the University of Stockholm was also here in February, explaining the challenges of her work in Sweden. And today, Well, today we're just thrilled to welcome Dr. Maggie McClure, who's now Professor Emerita at Manchester Metropolitan University, as well as her colleague, Dr. Harry Torrance. Where's Harry hiding? Also an internationally renowned educator who made the trip across the ocean, I'll tell the joke again, the ocean not yet renamed the American Ocean, from England to Georgia to be with us at UGA. Very early in my career, Maggie was a bright star across that ocean whose work I adored. I wanted to grow up to be like Maggie, I still do. We eventually met and have worked together on various projects over the years, and her work is always in the vanguard, clearing space for the next generation of researchers to respond to their local problems in their own historical moment by imagining new ways of thinking and being in the world. Dr. McClure is not only an inspiring scholar and researcher, but also a beautiful, graceful writer, and I revel in her sentences. As I've said before, we often meet kindred spirits in the literature, scholars who wrote 30 or 300 years ago. I was captivated by Maggie about 3 paragraphs into the first paper of hers I read, and then thrilled to meet her in person, experiencing the generosity, humor, intellectual rigor, and adventurous spirit I found in her texts. Together, Maggie and Harry nurtured generations of international researchers at Manchester's Education and Social Research Institute. Dr. Lisa Matze can tell you how generative that institute has been for her and many other scholars. Welcome to Georgia, Maggie and Harry. Given that this is the last lecture in this series of 6 lectures, I thought quite a bit about what to say here at the end. When I teach writing, I remind students that we typically write text for particular purposes and audiences, unless perhaps we're like Nietzsche and write for those who have the ears to hear. But we academics typically write for other academics, mostly in our own disciplines. Methodologists, however, have the luxury of writing for scholars in many disciplines. Much of my work, however, has always been feminist and post-structural, and is chiefly focused on various descriptions of human being and of language. That work has been published in methodology journals, even though I've ended up mostly refusing pre-existing social science research methodologies for reasons you heard me talk about this year. I do owe a great deal to the editors of methodology journals I've worked with, editors like Norman Denson and James Sherrick, who haven't censured my theoretical critique, but encouraged me and others by sponsoring special issues of journals about all aspects of inquiry. So the audience for my theoretical critique of pre-existing social science research methodologies has been in large part those who read methodology journals. But at some point, I decided to write specifically for doctoral students and early career scholars because those were the folks I knew the best. I've taught over 1,000 students in methodology classes here at UGA. I've served on many doctoral committees here and at other national and international institutions. I responded to hundreds of emails, mostly from students elsewhere, who were disenchanted with methodology and felt trapped in the normal science of their disciplines for one reason or another. In fact, this morning I responded to 2 students, one from the US and another from Turkey, who are disenchanted with the limits of pre-existing methodology and are looking for something else. I was that doctoral student, so maybe I'm writing for myself too. In short, I believe my audience has been the next generation, those who might not yet be captured, disciplined, and shut down by academic structures like our social science disciplines themselves and their research methodologies. I'm constantly reminded that the spaces in which we academics work can be very small. We may spend our entire careers at 1 or 2 universities in a particular department and in a particular program. If a scholar's work is too different, if they don't fit in, they can wither and die in such tiny spaces, and it can be difficult for their students to take wing and fly. We know our work is always local to some extent, but to limit our students, the next generation, to such small spaces normalized at a particular moment in history seems to go against the big dreams of education. So I write for students, for the future, for what Foucault called, what can and must be thought, what is not yet but could be, a lofty goal to be sure, but it inspires me. And the purpose of my work, it comes from scholars we now call post-structural, who invented concepts, conceptual practices, analyses, approaches to inquiry for their projects in response to problems the world posed in their own post-World War II historical era. Approaches that encourage the opening up of structures we create which limit us. Foucault's historical analysis, Derrida's deconstruction, Butler's critique of foundationalism, Spivak's demand that we attend to what we cannot not want, and Deleuze and Guattari's immanent concepts have been key for me. They helped me understand early as a doctoral student that the structures we create, the foundations we lay down, and the ideas we believe are real and true are not set in stone. They are simply descriptions which are historical and so are always already contingent. In particular material and historical contexts, we invent and create a world we must then live in, a world which can nonetheless be opened up and even redescribed so that something else can be thought and done and lived. As I've said, this looks like freedom to me, but we have to make that space for that freedom. We have to do the work and be willing to open up structures and crack foundations so that something different can be created. At that point, we lose control, if we ever had it, because we don't know what thought will do, what will come out, how the force of the new might shatter what exists. I think there's an ethics in the immanent ontology which informs this post-work, the understanding that humans are not so special, that we're not masters of the universe as our Enlightenment fathers claimed, that we don't precede the world but are completely embedded in it, a world which is always in continuous variation, always coming into being differently, moment by moment, always different, always new. Daniel Smith explained this difference in relation to Deleuze's immanent ontology as follows. On the one hand, he wrote, in Deleuze's ontology, every moment, every individual, every event is absolutely new and singular. Being is different. That is, it is the inexhaustible creation of difference, the constant production of the new, the incessant genesis of the singular. On the other hand, the ontological condition of difference is that in being produced, singularities tend to become regularized, made ordinary, normalized in Foucault's sense. And it is precisely this reduction of the singular to the ordinary that Deleuze calls the mechanism of capture, the inevitable processes of stratification, normalization. In this way, there's a constant struggle between creation and capture, the production and the normalization of difference, of the new. We may not even recognize the new. If we do, we may ignore or reject it as being too way out there. We may prefer to reduce its difference to the same, to capture and assimilate difference into existing structures so it loses its force. All this relies on an ontology of immanence, the new that is already in the world, immanent but not yet. So as John Rockman reminded us, the new is not at all what's in fashion, but rather what we cannot yet see or say is happening, because it's so difficult for the structures which control our thought to support real experimentation and fabrication of the new. In an interview in 1980, Foucault said that we need to produce something different that doesn't yet exist without being able to know what it will be. And the new can involve the destruction of what we are, as well as the creation of a completely different thing, a total innovation. Along those lines, Foucault said, we must refuse what we are, refuse the human invented by humanism's human science. Are we willing to do that? To become unintelligible to ourselves, to entertain people who do not yet exist? This is the lure and the risk of imminence. In my own work, resistance to the normalization of the new has been an ethical task and the engine of my work as a scholar and a teacher. It's very difficult, I think, to just let difference be different, to accept incommensurability in the face of the meta-narrative of comfortable consensus and final harmony. It's easy, I think, to say, oh, this is really not so different from that. Let's come together for the sake of solidarity or this or that, and forget our differences. Lyotard thought the valorization of conformist ideals of consensus could be terrorist, and Foucault wrote about the tyranny of goodwill, the obligation to think in common with others. I guess my point here is that when ontology changes, when we can think immanence, ethics changes as well. Ethics, especially in research, becomes, among other things, an acknowledgement that difference cannot be reconciled into what Fred Erickson calls some pragmatic smoothie. So with that, I conclude for now my comments about the audience and purpose of my work. The audience has been the next generation, and its purpose has been to try to open up space for them to experiment, invent, and create. That means they don't have to do what we did. That means helping them understand that the pre-existing research methodologies we invented in the 20th century are a historical phenomenon and not necessary, not the truth. That means that the impossibilities of one generation can become the possibilities of the next. I now want to contextualize all that with a brief survey of my history in academia. You know, if you stay in academia long enough, you'll have a history. As Maggie, Harry, and I can testify. And our histories are always local histories and a very small part of the world in which we've lived and worked. Today, I'll focus on my history as an academic, beginning with my training as a doctoral student in the US in the early 1990s, when I first became obsessed with two humanist concepts, human being and language. As I wrote in my paper for today's lecture, Post Qualitative Inquiry, the refusal of method and the risk of the new, it's difficult to escape our training. We academics come to the university for our doctoral studies at a particular time in our lives and learn the truth about this or that from the professors who happen to be there at the time. If you study with a pragmatist, you'll likely be a pragmatist. But if you come to the university the year after the pragmatist professor retires, you might study with a Marxist, and you'll likely be a Marxist. If you learn quantitative methodology, you'll likely use that methodology in your research and teach it to your students. We learn what we're taught, and then we teach what we know. This is how foundational truths of disciplines are created, repeated, and become real and true. It's not uncommon for a staunch scholar in social work or geography or psychology or literacy to say something like, well, this is the way we do it in social work or geography or literacy. So if you want to get a job or get tenure or be successful, you have to do it this way. We draw lines, set limits, ward off difference, and discipline our disciplines so they're recognizable and so we'll continue to fit. I was lucky as a new doctoral student at midlife in the early 1990s to find feminist scholars at Ohio State like Patty Lather and Laurel Richardson, who were leading their disciplines in putting structures under erasure, including research methodology. They were feminists who were refusing the positivism that dominated their fields then, were taking up and inventing qualitative methodology, and at the same time, they were trying to make the postmodern turn. The incommensurability of the realist ontologies of methodology and the imminent ontologies of postmodernism would create problems for my generation, but I didn't understand that then. I remember almost no conversations about ontology in my doctoral studies, though I studied all kinds of epistemology as one after another was theorized. As Elizabeth Rose explained, for over a century, ontology has become increasingly diminished as a concern of philosophical, political, and cultural reflection. It has been submitted to the domination of epistemology, theories of what knowledge is and does. Given my diligent training in pre-existing social science research methodology, whose focus is knowledge production, it may not be surprising that I didn't really study ontology until many years later when I had to, when immanence finally shattered the realism of qualitative methodology. But this story about my own entry into academia is much about the politics of location, which the feminists have always written about and which I mentioned earlier. Where and when do we come to academia? Who's there to direct our thought? What are the pressing issues of the day? What dominant dogmatic structures are we working in and against? Which of the world's problems become intelligible and recognizable in the thought and practices we've inherited to work with? We may not be able to answer those questions at the time, only later. As I've said and written, I mostly studied research methodology, both quantitative and qualitative, in my doctoral studies, which began in 1991. Mixed methods methodology hadn't yet been invented. There were many methodology courses available, but few theory courses. So I read post-structural theory on my own because my feminist professors were moving in that direction. I'm not sure I'd have found post-structuralism or any high-level theory unless I'd studied the feminist work of Judith Butler, Susan Heckman, Gayatri Spivak, Joan Scott, Elizabeth Rose, and others. Philosophical thought was not privileged in my doctoral program 35 years ago, and I'm not sure how prevalent it is in our doctoral programs now. My own doctoral students typically take more methodology than theory courses, and our college, like many others, no longer has an educational studies or educational foundations program where they study philosophy and history. Nonetheless, I hit the ground running when I came to UGA in 1995 and published several papers out of my post-structural dissertation, only to be brought up short 5 years later in 2000, when the Bush administration introduced the No Child Left Behind Act. That federal law created a new funding agency for educational research, the U.S. Institute of Education Sciences, IES. That's how easy it was to make education a science. Just add the word science and make it so. That's Grover Whitehurst, the first director of IES, was an experimental educational psychologist who championed positivist social science and quickly determined, along with several National Research Council committees, that randomized controlled trials were the gold standard of evidence-based, data-based, scientifically based research in education, and was the only methodology that could tell us what works in schools. We may have forgotten that this was the first time research methodology had been mandated in federal law, and it was a scandal. Notably, the definition of scientifically based research in education was positivist through and through, and did not include what Whitehurst and others call pre-scientific work. That is qualitative, ethnographic, descriptive, narrative, autoethnographic, or any kind of interpretive or critical research. Postmodernism became a code word for that kind of research, as well as research theorized around gender, race, social class, sexuality, and other areas of scholarship on identity categories. I remember an AERA session in which Grover Whitehurst announced to a huge ballroom of educational researchers that postmodernism, he used it to stand in for all research that wasn't positivist. He said postmodernism could not tell us what works in schools. And there we were, an experimental educational psychologist in charge of the federal agency funding educational research, which would fund only randomized controlled trials and quasi-experimental trials. Jessica Van Cleve, who was my doctoral student and is now a professor at Gardner-Webb University and is here today, won the AERA Qualitative Research SIGS Dissertation Award for her Foucauldian genealogy of scientifically based research and education, which tracked the appearance and legitimation of SBR. And another one of my wonderful doctoral students, Lee Elliott, who's here today as well, will defend her beautiful dissertation later this month. Now, Lee has used Foucault's concept, the economy of time, from discipline and punish, to analyze how SBR plays out day to day in teaching and learning now, 25 years after it was invented and installed in public schooling in this country. Positivism now prevails in education, theoretically, methodologically, and in practice in classrooms where students are mercilessly tested and quantified, where every minute of instructional time must be accounted for. The SBR debates were not just theoretical and methodological and scholarly, but always already political and personal. Senior male academics, proponents of SBR, went after quite a few feminist scholars who argued rigorously against SBR, and one used a string of pejorative adjectives to describe me personally in a journal article, most of which I've forgotten, except for vituperative. I had to look that one up, but it means marked by bitter and harsh criticism. He also accused me of postmodern contumely. I'll have to think about that, but contumely begins to feel a bit Shakespearean. Actually, some of my colleagues had a more precise name for our critique of SBR, post-structural feminism, whose critical power he and others found infuriating. But their predictable misogynist point was clear. Good women do not level criticism against the rational man who champions the scientific, objective, positivist science of scientifically based research. I'm sure they would not be at all happy with post-qualitative inquiry, which was invigorated by their comments. Of course, this story of unabashed, blatant sexism does not go away and has returned with this administration's war on women, education, and on science. The New York Times recently compiled and published a list of hundreds of words our federal agencies have flagged to limit or avoid using, including, not surprisingly, climate science, DEI, diversity, inequality, social justice, historically, and so on, but also feminism, female and women, but only men who have sex with men. Other men must be okay, but no women are okay. Getting back to scientifically based research, which has never been scientific, history, a word we should not use, tells us that the rage for evidence and data at the beginning of the 21st century quickly overwhelmed schools in this country. A veteran educational activist said last week that the Bush administration began the destruction of public education in this country with the No Child Left Behind Act, and the current administration might finish it. As I wrote this lecture, the federal government had canceled nearly $900 million in IES contracts, making the future of the funding agency precarious. On March 12, the New York Times quoted a research analyst who at the IRS said, for the most part, federal education research is over. As one who thought the IRS should never have existed in the first place, I'm not sure what to think about all that. Unfortunately, the critique of scientifically based research, vituperative or otherwise, has lessened as it has been installed and normalized in educational research and in schools for a quarter century now. There are teachers teaching and researchers doing research who have always been disciplined by the positivism of SBR and don't know it. In 1979, Leotard observed, "We are all stuck in the positivism of this or that discipline of learning." The goal of scientifically based research in education has been to learn what works in schools, which means it doesn't want to learn many other things. SBR became another example of what Leotard called an instrumental view of knowledge, positivist efficiency, hurried empiricism, and reducing complexity. And of course, how academic researchers can be complicit functionaries in the big knowledge production machines of epic state science. Quite a few of us spent years resisting SBR and defending qualitative and other kinds of non-positivist research. When I finally had enough and decided to get back to my own work, I found that the qualitative research I'd studied as a doctoral student, which had at least seemed emergent, had been tightened up, formalized, systematized, positivized, and scientized by SBR. Many textbooks outlined exactly what qualitative researchers should do and when they should do it. It was taken for granted that a social scientist had to have a pre-existing research methodology with appropriate methods in hand before beginning to inquire. This may have been a US phenomenon. A colleague in Sweden told me that she worked against social constructionism, not positivism. A colleague in Brazil told me they stopped teaching methodology at her university because all the studies looked the same. My colleagues in Australia have not seemed as obsessed with methodology as we are. But the students I worked with in the US seem much more concerned with methodology than with their topics or the philosophical formations that enable them even to think pre-existing methodology or their research questions. This is not to say that qualitative researchers were not only doing innovative and exciting work or interpretive and critical work, but it seemed to me they had to spend more time justifying going against the taken for granted grain of positivist qualitative methodology. My history with social science research methodologies and with qualitative methodology in particular was shaped then by what I believe was and continues to be a violent imposition of positivism on educational research and schooling at the beginning of this century, which has since become quite normalized. 20 years ago, the sociologist George Steinmetz wrote that a number of writers have referred to a positivist haunting of the sciences, depicting positivism's paradoxical power as a zombie-like refusal to stay buried. In a slightly different register, he wrote, positivism can be described as a kind of trauma from which the human sciences are still trying to recover. In the US, at least, I don't believe we've recovered, and I think positivism is so normal now, it's unintelligible. But that was the historical context in which the term post-qualitative inquiry wrote itself in the title of a handbook chapter published in 2011. Foucault wrote that in cases of domination, be they economic, social, institutional, or sexual, the problem is knowing where resistance will organize. Post-qualitative inquiry was my resistance to the relentless trauma of scientifically based research, to the US government's installation of positivist pre-existing methodologies and methods at the beginning of inquiry. It was a response to those who wanted and still want to control thought with method. And it is always already political and personal. Post-qualitative inquiry was a label for something I could not and cannot imagine, something that can never exist. It was and is an invitation to difference, a space for the next generation to experiment, create, and invent if they wish. Certainly, I could have called it something else, and I always encourage others to invent and name their own work. There's more room for difference than we can imagine, but we have to create it. We have to do the work to clear that space, and then always work against the capture and normalization of the force of the new, of difference. I read papers about post-qualitative inquiry that just must make it another pre-existing research methodology with its own methods. After SPR, it can be hard to think inquiry without methodology, without methods. I avoid the word method now because it seems to throw people into methodology. I avoid method and technique and process and all those words that are so bound to pre-existing methodology. In other lectures in this series, I've quoted scholars we now call post-structural who also refuse the positivism and method of their generation. Instead of using the word method or methodology, I like to talk about how we work and work differently given our training and our projects. A former architect who joins a social science department at a university might work quite differently from a painter or a biologist or an economist or a social worker. And what different scholars who study post-structuralism do might be quite different and different from one study to the next. I do insist that those interested in post-qualitative inquiry study the imminent ideas and concepts of post-structuralism. But after that, there are no instructions and no methods or techniques or practices or processes that exist in advance. But as Foucault wrote, only those I can find or that I forge as I'm actually doing my research, but without privileging the problem of methodology in any way. In his 1979 book, Lyotard actually described what he called postmodern science. So if you need a definition, here it is. He wrote that postmodern science, by concerning itself with such things as undecidables, the limits of precise control, conflicts characterized by incomplete information, fracta, catastrophes, and pragmatic paradoxes, is theorizing its own evolution as discontinuous, catastrophic, non-rectifiable, and paradoxical. Postmodern science is producing not the known, but the unknown. Lyotard also explained that this work relies on the verb tense, the future anterior, for all you English majors out there. He wrote, a postmodern artist or writer is in the position of a philosopher. The text he writes, the work he produces are not in principle governed by pre-established rules, and they cannot be judged according to a determining judgment by applying familiar categories to the text or to the work. The artist and the writer then are working without rules in order to formulate what will have been done. The future anterior, what will have been done. So the question in post-qualitative inquiry is not what to do, but perhaps what will have been done. Here at the end of this lecture series on post-qualitative inquiry, Leotard's description of postmodern science brings us back to immanence, which will always shatter the realist ontology of our pre-existing social science research methodologies. I've quoted the historian and philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, several times in these lectures because of profound questions he asked and observations he made decades ago about the natural sciences. One of his questions is, what must nature, including man, be like in order that science be possible at all? He asked a bit differently, what must the world be like in order that man may know it? In other words, Kuhn didn't assume the world is some stable object out there waiting for the researcher to do science on it. He didn't assume the world is real. His question suggests that scientists invent the human and the nature, the world, being on which their science can do science. In other words, they have to invent a world that aligns with their science. Our conventional humanist social science research methodologies assume a realist ontology in which scientists, their methodologies, and the world already exist and exist separately. To do science, the scientist applies her methodology to the world out there in order to know it, offloading truth and ethics onto the machine of method and procedure. Proper, objective, formalized, systematic method guarantees validity, truth, and goodness. In this story, possible only in a realist ontology, it's not the researcher's philosophical attachments or ontoepistemology or even her ethics that matters, but her methodology. This is how methodology comes to stand outside ontoepistemology, pretends to be a standalone structure from nowhere. And I expect this is why methodology texts pay short shrift to ontology. But as I said earlier, in an ontology of immanence, nothing exists ahead of in advance of the world. Everything is always in continuous variation, always coming into being differently, always new. For that reason, postmodernism's ontology of immanence simply cannot accommodate pre-existing methodologies that require a realist ontology. These two ontologies are incommensurable. And that's why Thomas Kuhn said that after a paradigm shift, scientists work in different worlds. They created different and incommensurable worlds for their different sciences. Their worlds are truly different. The point here, I think, is that immanence changes everything. The positivist desire to count, measure, predict, and control, evidenced in the realism of scientifically based research, as well as in pre-existing research methodologies, is unthinkable in immanence. In 1981, Baudrillard wrote that the real is not what it used to be. Given that, conventional realist empiricism set in opposition to rationalism no longer makes sense. Are mind and matter really separate? What counts as mind? What counts as matter? What counts as human is now unclear. All those words we've invented to separate, capture, and represent the wild profusion of existing things are insufficient when everything is entangled in immanence. The old words that represent don't work, and we need to invent new concepts post-representation that help reorient our thinking. I'm glad I had studied post-structuralism and feminism when the positivism of scientifically based research struck like a lightning bolt 25 years ago. It forced me to think post-qualitative inquiry as a space for me and perhaps others to experiment, create, and invent. I don't want my students to be captured by methods, to be functionaries of method, to be focused on every tiny grain of method, captured and capitalized by the methodology machine, now a big business in this country. I want the next generation to soar and fly because I'm counting on you folks to invent a new world and people who do not yet exist. We are limited only by what we cannot yet imagine, by what we cannot think and so do, by difference we cannot bear to embrace. I look forward to the radical work of the next generation whose violent, historical, and political moment is quickly coming into focus and will surely be an incentive to open up more spaces for resistance and invention. As I wrote at the end of the journal article for today's lecture, if you really look at the social science research methodologies invented in the last century, which have become almost sacred, they look strange indeed. We must remember that we made them up. We invented them in the last century for the last century's work. I encourage those of you in the next generation in this century to find your people, those who inspire and support you. I encourage you to work with your people to read hard, write hard, think hard, and invent new forms of inquiry. It's your century. It's your turn. So dig in and do outstanding work. There are many of us, like the distinguished scholars who joined our lecture series this year, who will be happy to help. Thank you.
Coming up for the back porch conversation.
Well, you are both hard at doing it, I have to say it. Oh, okay.
Maggie, I'm gonna ask you a question since everybody's heard me talking for too long. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing now, work you're interested in?
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm technically retired, but I'm not technically uninterested. And I'm still very much involved in the kind of work that I spoke about this morning, and practical research with young children. We have some continuing projects, but when you warned me you were going to ask me this question, I sat there in between being overwhelmed by your eloquence and indeed, thank you, by Stephanie's. And I was thinking, one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is the nature of relationality in a post-human or a new materialist ontology. So I've been giving quite a lot of thought to that. And I do think, and we can maybe talk about this too, that whole thing about relationality has been given a horrific new slant by what's happened recently. But one of the things that I've been thinking about is and it's not just me, that the vision of a post or more than human world of uninterrupted connectivity amongst all entities, virtual, actual, and so on, is problematic from a number of angles. I mean, one of the reasons that it's problematic is a logical one. If everything is always related, then nothing will happen. But of course, as soon as you try to move away from a flat ontology, you are required to think around hierarchy and think, well, what are the tensions and the forces that make things relate in the world? So I've been working with Glisson's work that I talked about this morning, just trying to think about how can you think of the prospect of productive relationality beyond what we can think now without falling back into those hierarchies? And one of the things, ironically, I guess, in some ways, is that one of the resources for that might be theory itself. There's a really excellent article by Claire Colebrook, written some years ago now, where she said the point of theory was to introduce the necessary difference that will animate ontologies. Anyway, that's a rather abstract argument from me. So now I'm going to ask you. Now I'm going to ask you anything. I just wanted to talk a bit more about science, actually, because it exercises me as well. On the one hand, we've seen all these intellectual and philosophical upheavals, and yet, as you completely accurately say, that sort of lumpen positivist certainty, state-mandated, government-mandated rage for reproducible knowledge has gone on underneath it all. But I did wonder if you saw any positive energy in the fact that within the posts, as people call them, and the new materialisms and so on, there have been, huge realignments and rapprochements between science and what we would have called the humanities and the arts. So, you have Karen Barad herself as a quantum physicist. You have people in our field like Liz de Freitas and Ezekiel Dixon-Roman, who are mathematicians who are seriously thinking the boundaries between mathematics and the social and artistic. You've got people like Simon Don, who's a philosopher of technology, lots of things about which I know nothing. So I tend to just, try to sort of keep my eye on it. But is there any prospect for productive change in our education system, say, from that? Or will that violence of positivism just continue to rumble underneath it? Answers on a postcard, thank you.
Well, that was a loaded question.
Yeah.
I think it's local. I'm not sure you live positivism the way we did here.
Well, it depends what you call it. But if anything, our school systems are more rigid and infused with that kind of dogmatic certainty about what counts, what is scientific, what is woolly. On the other hand, I think it's in that sense, I think they're definitely similar tendencies.
I don't think positivism is going to go away. I remember Patty Lather when all of this was happening and we were presenting at conferences and organizing special issues of journals to fight back. Patty said, positivism is the return of the living dead. And we all laughed, but it doesn't go away. I think we were talking earlier, it seems that every generation has to fight its positivism. We were talking about that, maybe, Harry. I didn't have to fight positivism very early because my professors were. They were doing that work. And I kind of got a free rein there for a while to do what I thought was something more interesting until it attacked me, and very personally, the name calling and all of that. And but for me, it was energizing. I remember having to stop and actually read positivism, spending a couple of years just reading all that stuff and just horrified that anybody could believe it. And that it was being deployed again, and not just about me, because, I'm an academic, but it was the teachers and the children in the schools who were getting it, and just being horrified. And I think finally realizing that didn't matter how much we taught back, it wasn't going to make any difference. They just stopped using some words, and then we started funding a little mixed methods work, sneaking in an interview study in something, and so it kind of went underground. But it's just like it's always there. Stephanie, it may be what you said, people who are just, what was it you said? People who are just mean or
Ruthless. And
it just somehow feels ruthless, this need to control. So my generation then, we had to fight it. I think those of you who are students now are having to fight it. And I encourage you to do some reading so you know what you're fighting. Actually read positivism and see what it's about. Those who want to control and those who want to loosen up, that's a real bad binary. What do you folks think? Anybody want to say anything? I'm looking at least, Ajay. He teaches me a little.
I'm very foundational in my thinking. I've been struggling with a lot of ideas that we've been discussing, and there is a ancient Indian philosopher Nagarjuna, 5th century AD, and he made quite a career for himself by demolishing any positive statement. And so he was a Buddhist philosopher, and they are very much against essence of any kind. So there's, and also any positive statement about the universe, he could demolish that logically. He had a very tetralemma-based argument, and so that has been done. But I've been wondering, and I'm thinking in terms of rapprochement that you mentioned, that maybe it's a world where we need both. And then among scientists, there's fairly common consensus now that all models are wrong, but some models are useful.
Yes.
So, and I come from India, and then we have had a nationalist party in power for quite some time. And we have seen that when positivism is given a short shrift, then what comes after? So now we have astrology as a discipline in universities and in science conferences. Scientists have talking about they have been flying chariots in ancient history. So do we really want to live in a world where positivism is dead? And if I would encourage all of us to imagine what would be a world like where it does not have positivism at all, where you cannot make any positive statement. So where you can't talk about hunger. Hunger exists, and that's a positive statement. So perhaps the world is complex enough to have both kinds of inquiries, and so that we don't do either or. I wonder what you think about.
Thank you. You know, I don't equate making a positive statement with positivism, I guess. So maybe we're talking about different things, Ajay.
So no, I don't see positive as an enemy.
I do. I do. We're just different, Ajay. You know, we're never gonna agree on that. I think science is fascinating. I mean, I like the field of science studies. There's an article in the New York Times about every other month about what the physicists have learned, that what they thought was a truth is not truth any longer, and now they have to rethink the whole universe. So, I think that work is fascinating, and I think we definitely need to pay attention. I think the social sciences, the split between the social sciences and the sciences and philosophy and literature, I mean, I think all that is just so detrimental to our thought. So yes, whatever we can use to help us think and trying to put things together and pull from other fields. The one thing I've said I always like about education is it will take anybody. If you're a chemist, we'll put you in the science ed department. If you're English major, we'll put you in language and literacy or something. If you're an accountant, we'll put you in, we've got a place for you. And it's such a rich field that we should be doing better about bringing all that to bear on the issues we're interested in, but I'm all for science. So I just wish I'd studied more science. It's not too late, I guess. There's always another PhD out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lizzie. Yeah, I wonder if what we're talking about as the iniquities of science is in fact science at all. It's such a depleted, clockwork assemblage of notions that don't necessarily these days have a very direct relation to the many, many different sciences that there are. And as you said, I mean, doubt in science is actually one of the things that underpins it. It's not that. So for me, by a much longer route that we couldn't really unpack today, I suspect that the stuff that angers and hurts us because it hurts children and learners and so on isn't really to do with science at all. In fact, it feels to me to be more like what I was talking about this morning from Glisson, which is the never-ending legacy of colonialism and the desire to regulate and govern and control populations. And it's very difficult to think outside that because that structures our language and our cognition and so on. And one of the things we were briefly talking about, Harry and you and I, before this lecture started, was that question of whether it's always going to be the way that the tendencies that resist certainty in favor of a more open and expansive possibility, like progressive education, can ever hold out against that desire for knowledge, accumulation of knowledge and of, material goods. And in that sense, I think we possibly won't get past it until that has been finally, if ever, dispensed with. But I'm not making consoling point to make there.
I know, I'm not very positive about it all, but, the other thing is that, every generation has this fight, and it's not like we're doing anything new. I remember when we were writing against, positivism, SBR, I remember just reaching over on my bookshelf and pulling out Sandra Harding, because she'd already said it all. And then reaching out for somebody, another feminist, or just reading something Patty Lather wrote in 1980. I mean, all this critique has already been done. We don't have to invent it. We just have to read it. We have to do the history and know what's happened and how different generations have had to push back against whatever, somebody said was the truth, including what we think is the truth. But we don't have to invent anything new here. The work is already out there.
Yeah,
Harry,
Just to build on that.
no, you have to take the mic.
Briefly, yeah, sorry about that. Just to build on that a little bit, I mean, I think, your emphasis on, history, learning the history of the field and the discipline, and also your final point about, the next generation needs to engage with, struggle with, take on these ideas and do something different with them. It just reminded me that, I mean, in my own training, one of the things that I was asked to read was Campbell and Stanley's a sort of classic paper, experimental and quasi-experimental research on teaching. And that was published in 1963. And they, in turn, lamented successive waves of engagement with advocacy for RCTs and disillusionment with RCTs, all the way back to the origins, really, of the discipline in the 1920s. And so what's that? That's now 100 years of ebbs and flows and waves as each new successive generation struggles with really the essential problems of what education is and how to engage with it creatively and productively. Some people look at it, as you say, more openly. Others want to control it in terms of the control of populations. But what I take from that history is that it does, these issues return and return and return. And there is an opportunity for people to engage with them successively.
We have a question from Zoom, from,
A Zoom question?
from Jim Sherrick.
Hi, Jim. Where are you, Jim?
Out there in Zoom land somewhere. Most of what you are saying aligns with Indigenous scholars and with decolonial thought. What are your thoughts? Just sounds like he would like to hear you talk about that.
I would entirely agree with what Jim has just said there, and I do think that's a potential source of re-energizing and also giving back that sort that sort of knowledge. I was in Australia doing some work at Deakin University before Christmas, and I was very struck there by not just by obviously the liveness of the issues of Indigenous knowledges and the extent to which they were and were not properly acknowledged and used, but also, I mean, I felt that a lot of the PhD students and the scholars there were themselves understanding and enacting post-human and post-foundational ways of thinking in ways that were definitely much more attuned to, first of all, the history of exploitation of natural resources and the peoples in Australia and New Zealand, but also more attentive, I think, perhaps than some of our students in the UK are able to be, about the effects of landscape and embodiment on the way that people live and think. So it's a long-winded way of saying to Jim, yes, I agree with that, and we've got a long way to go to fully acknowledge our complicity in those forms of knowledge not being there. But I do see that as one of the positive ways forward. Betty.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are probably civilizations and countries, for millennia who have had different ways of thinking about the world. Kind of, if you want to call it indigenous or whatever, but they're just not normalized. It's as if science kind of took over, or whatever took over in Western thought, colonialism, epistemology, to reduce different kinds of knowledge to positive science or whatever. So there's a lot out there to read and study in Indigenous work. I know quite a few of my students are really interested in Indigenous work. I don't think it's in our face here in the US the way it is in Australia and New Zealand, maybe. For some reason.
I would say it depends on where you are. In Oregon and Washington State and Minnesota. Oh, well, that's all I was gonna say. I feel, my body feels very different in different places around this country in terms of the impact and even the way, the language that people use differently. But as I've taught my students here, since I came here in 2007, and none of my students knew that there was a reserve an hour and a half north of us. So Cherokee, North Carolina is, a walkable, really. So it's, we have Indigenous people here at the university and in our communities and very near us. And those communities continue to be erased and ignored and minoritized and marginalized and silenced. So yeah, it's really shocking how few people even born. And this is also a function of education as well. We're also in a state where you can still walk into an elementary school around Thanksgiving and see children dressed up as quote Indians. So that would never happen in Washington State or Oregon or Minnesota or other places in this country, but it still happens right here in Georgia. So I think location, the politics of location matter.
Shall I just say one more?
Yeah.
Oh, it's really time to finish, so I'll give it quick. It was just following on briefly from what Harry said and Betty about the need for constant critique and vigilance, and I agree with that. But it also seems to me that we're in a very strange post-critical world now, at at the level of our rulers, where critique is simply like throwing gasoline on a fire. There's no interest in critique as something one would listen to and respond to. It's simply another placeholder for oppositional assertions to take place. So to return to Betty's question about what I'm thinking about at the moment, that's one thing that continues to exercise me. What's the nature of critique and what does it do?
No, I'm not sure. I'm really waiting for you folks out there, the next generation, to make some moves here and invent something, find what's already there, invent the new, do the critique, lead us. You know, it is your turn, it is your time, it's your century. Don't just keep doing what we did. We didn't do the best job, did we?
Great job.
I'm looking at Beth. I'm not gonna, what do you think, Flora? Flora's not gonna say anything.
Y'all did great.
I'm so grateful for all of you.
Flora's gonna go to dissertation to defend. so- I mean, I don't have any answers. I mean, I think that's local too. I mean, it seems to me that your politics is everyday politics. You know, you're in a conversation, you can say something back or you don't. Or you're teaching and you can say something or not. Or I think, you know, we're maybe approaching the bodies in the street phase where we just have to get out and march and be there and vast physical force. So I don't know what it's gonna be, but if you don't have something different to think with, I don't think you can do anything differently. So if you have something else to think with, then we have other options, and there's a lot out there to read to give you ideas about how to think and what to do next, and we just need to do the work. So, and I really do think it's important to find your people. Like I said, I remember when I first read Maggie's work and I thought, my God, I just love her. I don't know who she is. You know, I just love her because it was like, she was my people, whatever that was. I didn't know what it was. I had to figure it out. And then you read.
Betty and Patty and these people likewise, yeah.
You know,
But there's someone there for everyone.
Yeah, yeah. So you do have to find your people and they will help you. So do that work. And I also want to say, given that Jim Sherrick is listening, at least, Jim, if you're still here, you do need to take some political power. Jim is the editor of a journal. He's been the editor of a journal forever.
Great journal.
Great journal, and that's power. Organize conference sessions, write papers, do the work. Don't wait for somebody to come to you. Do the work, organize. I think that's as activist as anything else we do. So, and as we were talking this morning with you from Mississippi, am I right?
Yeah.
Have fun. Enjoy the work.
Yeah.
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 So thank you all very much. Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming to the lecture series. And I'm turning it over to you now. It's all in your lap. Michael, please.
We're on it. We're on it.